Good evening. My name is Rita Marsh. I'm co-founder and a board member of the Center for Human Flourishing in Carbondale, Colorado. And we're here this evening in the midst of winter and a pandemic with guests Connie, Baxter, Marlow, and Andrew Cameron Bailey.
Thank you.
Authors, futurists, filmmakers, and trend makers, I should also say, who have shared time with us doing programs before, but tonight is a very special program that they've been working on for a number of years. And this is a premiere presentation in the Roaring Fork Valley of their program, Pandemics, Gratitude, and Transformation. Connie and Andrew are co-authors of a book, The Trust Frequency, Assumptions for a New Paradigm. And this book was actually partially birthed here in the 3rd Street Center in Carbondale, thanks to Andrew's hard work and a former board member, Connor Johnson, who I must mention also. And in the research around the early formation relationship of the people from the Mayflower and the Pokanoket Indians and what we know now as Massachusetts, Andrew's research brought him to write a novel called The Mayflower Revelations, which has just been recently updated, I understand.
Second editions, fresh out of the press.
So, a book for the future, for guidance, The Trust Frequency, The Mayflower Revelations, for entertainment, and although it looks thick, it's actually a very quick read through. So I'm going to let Connie and Andrew take us forward into this journey about the first 54 years, the relationship between the Pilgrims from the Mayflower and the Pokanoket Indians on the land we just now know as Massachusetts. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you. It's an honor. I just want to thank everybody who made it here through how many feet of snow? It's amazing. And these spirits who actually showed up, you are, each of you, amazing. I want to point out that on the table in the back there is a little photographic essay I did that illustrates this story. In fact, they were all shot on Thanksgiving Day of this year in Plymouth, Massachusetts, right at the place where it all took place, where it unfolded. Starts out the very first image as a couple of Native American brothers and one of their homes, which was called a Wetu. And then here comes the Mayflower, and managed to find images to illustrate this story in Plymouth in 400 years later. So this is a 400-year-old story told through about 20 still photographs. I just wanted to mention that, Connie. So when we take a break or when we're done, please have a look at those photographs. And any questions, I'll be delighted.
And it's thanks to the Plymouth Patuxent Museums that this recreation of the Pokanoket village and the English village exists today, that people can visit. And the story is evolving there as their archaeological evidence is showing that the Pilgrims and the Indians lived together and exchanged recipes and artifacts. So this isn't just speculation, that there was peace and friendship between these two cultures at the founding of this nation. So what we're going to do is show the similarities to now because of the pandemics that hit both of those people at the time in the 1620s and or earlier for the native people, but we'll go into all that. So there was a pandemic that came down the eastern seaboard that took out the Indians 2 years before the Pilgrims came, and the Pilgrims, half of them died the first winter due to scurvy. So in the spring of 1621, when they met, they were both grieving people who had lost so much and were so full of gratitude to meet each other. And out of that gratitude came the United States of America, ultimately.
And
the principles and ideals.
And came the first Thanksgiving. If you
Well,
like
we
to.
call the first Thanksgiving,
Right.
but it was a time of Thanksgiving between these cultures, and ultimately the principles and ideals that evolved out of that became the promise that the United States of America made to the world that we have yet to realize, and it's up to each of us to do that now. So that's what this is for, is to bring forward inspiration from that time. Do you have any thoughts, Andrew, before we get started?
I just wanted to emphasize, as you can see, pandemics. Ooh, that's scary. Gratitude? What? Exactly, that's the point. Thanksgiving. Why was there such a sense of gratitude and thanksgiving at that event 400 years ago right now? Interesting.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting sort of overarching question to pose as we retell. I know that all of you know something about the Pilgrims, the Indians, the first Thanksgiving. But there's a way of telling it that I think you will find to be unique.
Yes, and more complete than it's ever been told before. And what we want you to do is really think of these people as people. The Pilgrims have been lumped into this, the Pilgrims came, and all this happened, and now we've got a mess on our hands 400 years later because of the Pilgrims. Well, I'll tell you one thing, they were my ancestors, and those people were allies of the native people today, because they stood up to a government, a king of England, that wouldn't let them worship in their way, and which they believed was our right to worship with a direct connection to the divine, which is exactly the native way of being, was a creator-based life's way of life. So once people realize the allies that these people were and are today with what they stood up for, we will start to see us come together again in another synthesis, time of synthesis, which we call the third great synthesis. So we just want you to open your hearts to the humanity of these people, of the native people and of the Pilgrims. Moms, dads, and kids who put their lives on the line for this. Are we willing to do that now? Maybe, maybe not. So let's just have a look at this little history lesson we're going to give you. So here we go. The intercultural origins of the U.S. of A. And that's the us of A. That's you and me and all of us that we have to realize this promise. So here we go. Gratitude as a vehicle to transformation, because gratitude is a high vibration. And as we live a life of gratitude for every little thing, we start to vibrate at a higher level, and we access a higher frequency, which we'll be talking about. So, from our point of view, humanity is on an evolutionary upward spiral to peace on earth. So our perspective, we look at the light of humanity, what we've been from our hearts in the past. We let the shadow go because we've been evolving, and we've done the best we could given the circumstances we were in and the vibratory level that the earth was in at the time. And now the earth's in a higher vibration, so we get to move up in our vibration and on this evolutionary upward spiral. And just chime in anytime you feel so motivated. Maybe.
Or simply ask me to take over, if there's a particular point
would you like to
me
just
to
speak of this one?
So, an origin story, myth and misinformation. So, I'm not a Mayflower descendant to the best of my knowledge, whereas Connie here is. Her ancestors landed in what is now known as Plymouth, Massachusetts, 400 years ago. And that's grown into this massive myth on the one hand, Myth doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, but it's the sort of the story upon which a culture, a society is based. Misinformation. One of the things I learned early on after I met Connie 18 years ago is that there is a huge amount of toxic, I'll use that word, misinformation about the Mayflower Pilgrims. These were religious people, extremely religious people. They knew that not only their every act, but their every thought was being watched by whatever they believed God to be. So they really, really, really had to behave themselves. Think about that. They truly believed that. They behaved themselves impeccably for more than half a century. And when they finally met the Native Americans and crafted the peace treaty between them, that peace held for more than half a century. That's pretty extraordinary. And I think that's kind of a forgotten gem at the founding of this country. So let's see here. A story that reflects our level of consciousness. The Swinging Pendulum. Yeah, so the story has shifted over the ages and the pendulum has swung. There was a long period of time during which the people who were not called the Mayflower Pilgrims at the time, they were simply a group of separatist English radical religious people who did not agree with the Church of England and therefore had to leave England and go looking for an alternative. And somewhere in their early writings, there's the phrase, and they knew they were pilgrims, and that's where that came from. So they'd be called the Pilgrims based on that one little phrase. When they left into the unknown and got on a ship out of Holland to go to America, back when that was a very dicey thing to do, they knew they were pilgrims.
And our story, we've glorified the Pilgrims, which they deserve. I promise you, if you research who they were and what they did in the evolution of consciousness for humanity, with their lives, with their kids, you will be astounded. And they deserved every bit of glorification they ever had. But what happened to us when the pendulum was over here, the Indian was left out of the story. It was just Squanto planting corn, which you saw a picture at the beginning of Squanto teaching them how to plant the Indian corn, which they didn't know how to do. And then the first Thanksgiving with the mythologized first Thanksgiving. And then the Indian just wasn't around as people, as the power of their way of life and who they were in their hearts and spirits. So that had a pendulum out of balance. And now it's swung way over here to demonize the Pilgrims, to honor the Indian. So here we are, and what we're doing is bringing it up here to the fulcrum with a new story, so we can get up and out of victim, perpetrator, who did what to whom, and we've got a story of synthesis that we came together in our hearts for a period of time and planted the seeds that were to become a yet-to-be great nation, because we're still a work in process. So we say, what's next? Recognizing our common humanity and looking at the light that we've been and focusing on that and to what we can be. So let's go on here. So I push this. So what now? I wrote this little piece in 1995 when I first met my first visionary Native American elder. And what I saw at that time was that when we come together as equals, as family, and we each open our hearts and our minds to the other, the melding of our gifts will bring a new perspective that is invisible at this time. This new perspective will allow us to see the path to true unity, peace, and freedom. Not all the stuff we've been thinking is unity, peace, and freedom. In this reality, it's a whole new ballgame in another reality that's never been on the planet before. So that's that vision that I articulated in 1995.
So Connie's been at this for a while.
I've been at this for a while. And here's the Hopi Prophecy that says a similar thing.
Would you like me to read this? When birds fall from the sky and the animals are dying, a new tribe of people shall come unto the earth from many colors, classes, and creeds, who by their actions and deeds shall make the earth green again. They will be known as the warriors of the rainbow. That would be us, friends. This is our job. Who said it? Our job to do it.
So, the evolutionary leap. Well, how are we going to take that evolutionary leap that we're on with this upward spiral? We're going to be healing our personal ancestral trauma. That's what's going on right now, is this deep healing that must occur for us to be able to open our hearts because of the millennia of humanity doing really nasty stuff to itself. Man's inhumanity to man from all races, all colors, have been in a lower vibration, even though we've all had a high understanding of God, the divine, the creator, a way of life that we aspire to. And all cultures have that, but all cultures have had this shadow piece as well. So we're moving into that higher way of being, higher way of seeing, because the earth is moving into this higher frequency. So we move into oneness, we move into bringing peace on earth through our open heart, because then when we open our hearts, we move into a higher frequency where peace on earth is a given. So here we are going to speak on the spiritual origins of a yet-to-be great nation, because everybody's feeling like America's just gone down the tubes. But guess what? It's all a process of coming into our hearts and cleansing out behaviors and belief systems that have been in place for millennia in the hearts of man. Not really in their hearts, but outside of that armor that's armored our hearts as we've dealt with these lower frequencies. So, Andrew, why don't you speak on this whole big picture of this process that we're sharing with you?
All right. So let's go back to the late 1500s in England. Let's go back to Cambridge University during the latter years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Oxford was kind of the science university. It was Isaac Newton and so on. And Cambridge was more the spiritual university, the theological university. And so during this period, what was happening in Europe? We've heard of people like Martin Luther, John Calvin. The Bible was translated from the Latin into various European languages, modern languages, contemporary languages, meaning that all of a sudden you could pick up this book and read it for yourself, instead of being dependent on a priest who had studied Latin or Greek or both in college, right? So all of a sudden we can think for ourselves. We don't necessarily need to be told what to think, to be taught how to think. So that was the beginning of one of the biggest explosions in human consciousness and therefore political and cultural evolution that we have seen in the last 1,000 years or more, right? Starting in the late 1500s, the late 16th century, and into the very early 17th century, when a movement began, and you've probably all heard of the Puritans. It was obvious to those who read the Bible for themselves, and many of these people were ministers of the Church of England. By the way, 100 years earlier, Henry VIII had broken away from Rome, broken away from the Pope, but hadn't changed very much in terms of the structure. He just put himself in place of the Pope. Henry was the new Pope. He called himself the king. So you had the divine king, you had the absolute monarch. What the king said was what you did, or you lost your head. It was a very serious matter. But a group of people began to realize that it was necessary to purify the church. That's where the word Puritan comes from. Those who thought that it might be possible to purify the church. This started, as we have just agreed, in the late 1500s. By the early 1600s, another group had realized that that's never going to happen. They have too much power. These bishops, all of this pomp and circumstance and money and gold and power, good luck. And so those who were trying to stay within the church and purify it were meeting massive resistance. So another group unfolded or emerged that we now call the Separatists. They realized the only thing they could do was to separate from the church. Except for one thing, it was treasonous to separate from the church, because don't forget the king was the head of the church. If you disobey the king, off with his head, off with her head. Serious matter. And they don't take your head off until they've done a few other nasty things to you. So there was torture and all sorts of really brutal, barbaric things that happened to people who disagreed with the current paradigm. It wasn't just like, oh, we can just go somewhere else and do something else different. So, long story short, this group of separatists had to leave England. It was difficult, it was challenging. It took them several attempts, but they finally managed to move to Holland, which, as today, was a very liberal country, had religious tolerance, and stayed there for 12 years. During that 12 years, however, the children of that little group of separatists were becoming Dutch. The people weren't doing very well there. Leaders were doing pretty well because they were Cambridge educated and they could teach in the colleges and so on. But the guild system in Holland meant that you couldn't go and say, I want to be a goldsmith, or I want to be in any of the various guilds and trades, because it was hereditary. You were not born into it. You weren't trained by your grandfather and your father. So they were kept at a very low, menial position within the culture, and finally decided to leave, and they left, as we very well know, in 1620. Long, dramatic story, but 66 days at sea. Finally, in November of 1620, 400 years ago last year, they sighted Cape Cod.
Yeah.
And made landfall.
And there was also this going on at the same time.
At the same time was this huge scientific explosion, a paradigm shift in science, right? So you'd had basically the Pope and the Vatican telling everybody what to think on every level. And suddenly science was breaking off here. New Protestant people were protesting against the status quo. So something was happening, the splintering of something that if you went 50 years before it began, you would assume it was God put the king in place. God said the sun goes around the earth and all of those things. And if you said differently, we know what happened to Galileo, right? So
the scientific paradigm separated us from our hearts, from the rest of nature. And this was a beginning of this industrial revolution, of this situation we have right now, where we're separate from. Humanity feels it's separate from. And we're just starting now, because of the situation with the climate crisis, we're realizing, hey, we're not separate from anything. And as we realize that and we open our hearts to the rest of creation, which is the native way, the Native Americans know that we are one with all of creation, and they honor the sacredness and oneness of all life. So here's this dichotomy with the brain and the heart, started here with Descartes and Newton and this scientific paradigm. So it's a very interesting matter that here were the separatists saying, hey, we get to relate directly to the divine, and here's Newton and Descartes and all those guys saying, hey, we're not part of anything. There's no divine, there's no nothing. It was just us, and it's a bunch of billiard balls clinking around, creating a materialistic world that has no spirit, no life. So we've got those two movements hand in hand going forth. And guess which one won out? This one. So what's coming forth now is the native way, is what the Pilgrims were seeking. So here we go on this ride into our hearts. And we can take this inspiration from the Pilgrims who came here, met with the Native Americans in this first great synthesis that we call it the first great synthesis. So we left, so let's see, did I switch it?
Let me say a word about Connie's term, the first great synthesis, and there's a second one and a third one. Synthesis, a coming together of two or more elements into something that is bigger than any of those elements put together. So the coming together of the English with the Native Americans resulted in a different kind of human being. Different assumptions, different beliefs, different ways of pronouncing words, different ways of language, song, art.
Yeah.
Americans.
The American mind.
The American mind began in Plymouth in 1621 with the very first meeting.
That first synthesis, that 54 years of peace and friendship. So we're moving from monarchy to democracy because there's an innate desire to be free that we all have, and that humanity has evidenced through the years, through the centuries, but this scientific paradigm, this lower frequency has kept us separate from this reality of true freedom. So we move from monarchy to democracy. I think we should just run through this pretty quickly.
We can do that. So this is a timeline, essentially, starting way back in 1215 with the Magna Carta, one of the very first documents of just the earliest inklings of the potential for democracy, where people would actually have self-determination.
And at the same time, the Iroquois Great Law was coming here to the Americas. So you see there's a universal impulse that occurs in the heart of humanity. So here's the Magna Carta, and here is the Iroquois, the great peacemaker, coming to the Iroquois and bringing the warring tribes together in the 1200s.
At exactly the same time historically, I think for our species, that's interesting that these things would happen at a different manifestation of a similar thing at the same time. The Scrooby Covenant in 1606, Scrooby's a little town in Northamptonshire in England, where the Separatists met and had their religious services, which were illegal and treasonous. And that's where the whole thing really came together. And the folks who met created this, again, what would you call it, a covenant, a document, or even a compact, an agreement that stated their beliefs. The Scrooby Covenant is once again a very early precursor of the ideas that we now think of as democracy.
And then we have the Mayflower Compact, which they drafted in the cabin of the Mayflower before they landed here. And we'll go through this quickly so that you can see the essence of all this, that it is the beginnings of democracy.
So the Mayflower people, there was the potential for mutiny, literally, among the groups. When they landed, who knew what was going to happen, and they realized it was essential to come to an agreement.
Yeah, and then we have the U.S. Constitution. But here's the Scrooby Covenant. As ye lords, free people, joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in ye fellowship of ye gospel, to walk in all his ways, made known or to be made known to them, according to their best endeavor, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. And that's quite a little agreement to make amongst yourselves and with the Lord. Like, okay, Lord, we're doing this thing. And I think that many of you here live spirit-guided lives, and you respond to that directive from Spirit. So that's what's coming. That's what's up, is that we get to live that way as the Lord's free people. So It's going to be an exciting unfolding. So here's King James I, absolute monarch, head of the Church of England, saying, I will harry them out of the land, these folks that met secretly. But he wasn't chopping heads off at that point. Was there any chopping heads off at that point or later?
Some of them were in prison, some of them more vocal of them. You had to be really careful what you said and where you said it. And if you didn't, you would just come with us and you might not be seen.
Yeah, does it sound familiar with other governments and stuff? Anyway, so here's the Pilgrim Trail. 1606, the Scrooby Covenant. 1609, they escape from England, arrive in Leiden, Holland. They're lecturers at Leiden at the university, and they're tradesmen, as Andrew explained. They leave Holland for America in 1620, and with a vision of a society based on freedom of conscience. That's our direct relationship to our hearts and to the divine. And they draft and sign the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and in 1621, they connect with the Massasoit and a creator-based spirituality. So it's the birth of the American mind, spirit, and democracy, ultimately. And we call it the first great synthesis. So here's just some little photos, paintings of these occurrences. The signing of the Mayflower Compact, the Pokanoket Treaty that we'll speak of, that was signed on the first meeting with the natives, and then the 3-day harvest celebration later in the fall, and 54 years of peace and friendship. So we'd like to now just share with you the Mayflower Compact, because that is a little paragraph that states that they will form themselves into a civil body politic. And I'll just read this, because this little paragraph states it very well. It's not the actual compact, and we actually have the compact here, but this day, before we come to harbor, observing that some were not well affected to unity and concord, but gave some appearance of faction, because there were these pilgrims that call themselves the saints, and then there were the strangers, the people who had come through the folks who had financed the operation, but they were also friends of the Pilgrims. So they weren't the Separatists, but they were friends of the Separatists, generally speaking. So it was thought good that there should be an association and agreement so that we should combine together in one body and submit to such government and governors as we should, by common consent, agree to make and choose. We therefore set our hands to that follows, word for word. And this is the Mayflower Compact.
And think of this in the context of absolute monarchy.
So,
this is a revolutionary statement, is it not?
So here it is. In the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such equal and just laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So there you have it, equal and just laws serving the common good.
And every town meeting they had for the next, I don't know how many decades, they read this out loud. So this became their manifesto.
So here is the timeline of their arrival, because this is very interesting. Do you want to read that, Andrew? And let's just run through it quickly.
Okay, so on the 9th of November 1620, they made landfall off the coast of Cape Cod.
So realize this is the 9th of November in New England. It was a mini ice age, much lower temperatures than normal, and it was November.
Yep. They were delayed, horribly to their cost. They drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact on the 11th of November, 1620. They had their first encounter with the Native Americans. Sorry, I'm just going to read this to you.
Right, but you need to, so people can hear you.
I'm hoping you can all hear me. Their first encounter, so-called, was actually a kind of violent one. They were on the shore exploring, looking for a place to establish their little village, and they were attacked by a group of Native Americans with bows and arrows. And they collected in the morning, they collected 18 arrows and sent them back on the next ship to England. But fortunately, nobody was killed, nobody was injured, and it had rained, so they couldn't get their muskets to fire in the morning, but the minute they did get one to fire and the bang went off, the Indians ran away, because that loud noise just was terrifying to them. They continued their explorations and found the site of present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, the home of so-called Plymouth Rock, and they actually landed, came ashore for the first time on the 18th of December, 1620. December. Like, think of the weather right here, right now in this valley, something like that. Cold, icy, and you can't get your ship within a mile of the shore, and you can't even get the little shallop boat that brings you back and forth closer than knee-deep to waist-deep water. So you had to wade through this water, which cost half of them their lives. The general sickness was the result of that. Firstly, they were 66 days at sea. They were seriously deprived of many of their needs, and they, especially vitamin C, that nobody knew they needed in those days. So, probably scurvy combined with strange microorganisms, foreign microorganisms in the water they drank once they landed, because that was different for them. It was called the general sickness. Half of them died. In the spring, on the 16th of March, 1621, this tall, handsome Native American man came striding into their encampment and greeted them in English. He said, "Welcome, Englishmen." How extraordinary. Can you imagine that?
Can you imagine the gratitude?
Can you imagine, like,
we'll go into it.
They ran for their muskets, and they were, "What do we do now?" And the guys, "Welcome, Englishmen." He was from Maine, and he knew a lot of the English sea captains, and he knew a few words of English. Amazing. He gave them some orientation as to where they were and what the recent history had been, and said, "I'm going to go and come back with the local chief." The Pilgrims saw him as their king, the king, who you can also call the Massasoit, which is a title. 5 or 6 days later, came back with the Massasoit. They sat down and crafted a 6-point mutual protection agreement on that very first meeting, which
the 22nd of March, which was
on the spring equinox.
Spring equinox.
Yeah. And then at the end of that year, note that we're well into 1621 now, 400 years ago this year, in the fall, they'd actually had a successful harvest, and they had a traditional harvest celebration, which was traditional everywhere. It was traditional to the Native Americans, but it was also traditional to the Dutch. The big harvest festivals in England, all of those important times have been celebrated since ancient times.
So we're going to give a little context to this whole thing, because that's what's relevant to right now for us with this pandemic that we've been suffering, a global pandemic. So the context of then and now. So there was a great pandemic that was called the Great Dying 2 years before the Pilgrims came. Do you want to speak about that, Andrew?
So I think it's well known that there was an epidemic of disease on the East Coast that profoundly affected the coastal Indians in the early 1600s, starting around 1612, 1614, and ending by 1619, and the Mayflower showing up in 1620, in the aftermath of a situation where, well, they came ashore and there were skulls among the rocks on the beach. There were unburied skeletons on land. It was a Golgotha. It was something terrible had happened there. This was the gloom over Patuxet, as it was then called, Plymouth, Massachusetts, at that time. They chose to come ashore here because there was nobody around. It seemed like a safe place. There was water, there was land, there were signs of previous occupation because there were cornfields and so on, the remnants of cornfields. And that disease that took them out has been commonly believed to have been smallpox. And it was even believed to have been brought by the Mayflower, but it happened several years before the Mayflower, so that's not a possibility. It actually, according to my understanding, and I've researched this deeply, was the plague, bubonic plague. And it's called the plague in the earliest English reports of this pandemic. And it was a pandemic. Pandemic means global. The plague started in what you would today call China, made its way very slowly over centuries through Europe and across the mountains and into and devastated Europe, finally jumped to England in the mid-1300s, took out 60% of London, and sat there for a long time because now you've got a couple of thousand miles of ocean. Good way to defend yourself against these bacteria. But eventually, through a French fishing vessel and a rat, most likely, the plague managed to make its way across the Atlantic and land up in what we today call the maritime provinces of Canada, in the region of the St. Clair River. At the time, there was a war going on between the native tribes. It's known as the Territeens War. Territeens, that's not a Native American word. You're right, it's not. It refers to a Native American group, but it was a Basque word. The Basque fishermen had called this particular group of seafaring Native Americans the Territeens. And long story short, there was competition between the Territeens and the Penobscot over control of the French fur trade. Typical human behavior. We're not going to collaborate and cooperate, we're going to compete, right? And if you don't agree with me, we're in trouble. So, again, it's a long and complex story, and you can read it in the novel, The Mayflower Revelations, because it's laid out in detail there. The warriors from the north came down to Massachusetts Bay in revenge for the Massachusetts tribe supporting the Penobscot against the Territeens in this war. And revenge was swift in coming, and the warriors who came down, unfortunately, carried with them in their bodies the bacteria that caused the Black Death, bubonic plague. That's that story. And it simply wiped out. Captain John Smith in 1614 mapped the whole area of Massachusetts Bay. At Patuxent, he estimated 2,000 warriors. When the Mayflower landed in 1614, 6 years later, there was nobody there. 2,000 warriors to zero. Something really, really horrific had happened.
And when the Mayflower landed, they lost half of their people in the epidemic that first winter.
So here's the title of this whole presentation. It starts with the word pandemics, plural. So we know, all of a sudden, everybody knows this term pandemic. We have this COVID pandemic going on right now as we speak. But back then, the Native Americans were just the next people to get the bubonic plague. The Mayflower Pilgrims, you couldn't call that a pandemic. They came ashore, and half of them died the first winter. And they died of what they called the general sickness. They didn't call it a plague or a pox or any of those things. They simply called it a sickness, which killed them. Okay, so
my ancestors had killed my great-great-great-great-grandmother, grandfather, and their son, and left an orphan daughter, an 18-year-old orphan daughter named Priscilla. And Priscilla became very famous by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the courtship of Miles Standish, when she said, "Speak for yourself, John." And when John Alden was pleading Miles Standish's love for Priscilla, and she said, "Hey, John, you handsome devil, you, speak for yourself." And they became America's first couple. So that's my sweet story. But the 102 passengers, half of them dying, left 4 adult women. Okay, like 15 of them died the first winter. 14 adult men and 34 children,
Yeah.
ages 1 to 6 to 18. I'm having trouble reading here. And these are the people who attended the 3-day harvest celebration in the fall of 1621, when 90 warriors and the Massasoit came.
And probably their wives and children, and it was quite a party. Went on for 3 days. Now, here's the second word. So the first word in the title of this evening's presentation is Pandemic's Gratitude. So I just want to have you think about the emotional state these two groups of people were in. Think of the Native Americans. They had lost between 70 and 90% of their population just over the last 5 years. Wow. Imagine how they felt. Nobody talked. You read the history, they never talk about feelings. It's, oh, so-and-so did this and so-and-so, and they had a battle, and so-and-so, that's it. Think of them as humans. Think of the feelings. And think of the Mayflower group who landed as 102 people, and by the time of that first Thanksgiving, whenever it was, we don't know the date, sometime in the fall, they were down to 52. That lost pretty much exactly half of their population, including Connie's ancestors. Exactly. How were they feeling? And so the Indians were probably afraid of this group of English people who came. They had a couple of small cannon, they had muskets, and they would really have to wonder what these people were doing, right? And the English were very aware of some of the stories of what had happened to previous attempts at planting colonies. It was a very dangerous thing to do, and many of them didn't succeed because of the warlike folks who already lived there. They weren't going to let them land and set up camp. So, fear and grief, and then finding each other. And they had about 5 or 6 months to prove their relationships. They first met on March 22nd of 1621. And by the fall, they'd been living together, working together, growing crops together, producing food together, exchanging all kinds of things, learning each other's languages together. Imagine the degree of gratitude that was rising up in them. Starting out with this, oops, this is scary, fear, grief. Turning it around, transformation into the sheer joy and gratitude of being safe and having friends.
Because the Massasoit was being threatened by the Narragansetts who hadn't been touched by this plague. So he was very thankful to have the Pilgrims with their cannons and with all that they could bring to his situation with the Narragansetts.
The Narragansetts were estimated to have 3,000 warriors, and Massasoit was down to 90.
And so now we have
wiped out overnight.
And so now we have this global pandemic and the grief that we're feeling now and the challenges. And so we're just saying to find some gratitude for life, for every single moment of every single day. That's what's bringing this whole Omicron. Now it's everywhere, so we better just be thankful for every minute of every day. And that gratitude and the grief that we're feeling for the loss of life, they're both transformational. They both take us to a higher frequency. The grief gives birth to aspects of ourselves we never knew was there. And the gratitude takes us into a higher way of being. So, so we have a similar situation. It's extraordinary that this pandemic has come here, just right here in this 400th anniversary time of this meeting with the Pilgrims and the Indians. So, transformation, grief, breakdown, rebirth, that's where we're at right now. That's where they were at then. And so we can just take that inspiration and take it further into our lives and bridge our differences. go forward and listen to it with an open heart to what the different opinions, beliefs, everything, how they can contribute to our expanding our own knowing just by listening and opening our hearts and letting a synthesis occur now between this disparate situation that we have right now and this, what we're calling the third great synthesis with the native people, the indigenous peoples of the world, as we move through this climate crisis into a love of the earth and all of creation. So, so here's Samoset coming into, that we're just going to run through this process.
Welcome, Englishmen. Can you imagine that? I mean, what a relief.
So here's the mutual protection agreement that started the 54 years of peace and friendship. And then I'll just read you this piece from Good News from New England. See, the Pilgrims kept journals of every day. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then they sent it to England, and it was published at the time. So it's not about victors writing about history. It's about people writing their experiences. So this is about the treaty. Our messenger made a speech under him. This is to the Massasoit who came on that March 22nd, saying that King James saluted him with words of love and peace, and did accept of him as his friend and ally, and that our governor desired to see him and to truck with him, which is to exchange goods with him, and to confirm a peace with him as his next neighbor. He liked well that speech, and heard it attentively, though the interpreters did not well express it. After salutations, our governor kissed his hand, and the king kissed him, and so they sat down. Then they treated of peace. I mean, these guys kissing each other? I mean, who would have thunk? And this is the treaty. We can run through that quickly. That neither he nor any of his should do hurt to any of their people. This is in the third person. That any of his, if any of his did hurt any of theirs, he should send the offender that they might punish him. That if anything were taken away from any of theirs, he should cause it to be restored, and they should do the like to his. If any did unjustly war against him, that they would aid him. If any did war against them, he should aid them. He should send to his neighbors' confederates to certify them of this, that they might not wrong them, but might be likewise compromised in the conditions of peace. That when their men came to them, they should leave their bows and arrows behind them. And that this was the seventh one, wasn't part of the 6-point treaty, that King James would esteem Massasoit as his friend and ally. So then we have the Department of Immigration.
It's hard to believe they actually had a welcoming committee there at State Department, and it says, Chief, signing executive order letting you stay in country. So yeah.
So here we have the summer and fall, the grief, the sorrow and the grief, Squanto teaching them how to plant corn and catching eels, them making friends. They had threats from the Massachusetts and the Narragansett and all. They built their fort. They had a bountiful harvest and a 3-day celebration. So here's this is a beautiful painting that's very specific. It's the exact number of people, and they all different personalities of the different pilgrims. And the chief, the Massasoit and his people. So this is a very accurate rendition of the situation. So this is the only extant writing about that 3-day celebration that we call the first Thanksgiving. It wasn't the first Thanksgiving for anybody, but we call it the first Thanksgiving. Because, as Andrew said, Thanksgiving had been celebrated by all people through the ages. So here it is. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling. that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, among other recreation, we exercised our arms. They had to exercise, once a month they had to exercise the matchlock guns to keep them activated. And so the Indians were used to that, hearing those guns go off. We exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. So that's a sweet little paragraph that speaks of a 3-day celebration amongst people who cared about each other and contributed to each
somebody
other.
who was there. Yeah, and that's all we have. It's the only description that survived, but there it is.
And so there's some story that the because of the treaty, that when they exercised the arms, they were afraid that there was a war going on or something that they needed help. So the warriors came to help. So that's a sweet telling of the story as well, an interpretation.
You'll hear that from a lot of the natives on the East
Yeah,
Coast.
which is a
We're told those
sweet
stories.
interpretation.
The only thing is there was a 46-mile distance between them, and I'm not sure you'd hear the guns that far away.
So I don't know if this will play, but this is a little expression
Oh, you
of...
didn't test it right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll let this
Here's a
go.
little excerpt from a video that we made.
But, let's see.
Will it play? Will it not?
No.
If-
Oh, here
We
we go.
have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them, and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them. Not only the greatest king amongst them, called Massasoit, but also all the princes and peoples round about us, have either made suit unto us, or been glad of any occasion to make peace with us. So that 7 of them at once have sent their messengers to us to that end. So that there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly, neither would have been but for us. And we for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us.
So that's a sweet little passage that really speaks of the friendship.
Now, you may not believe it, but I was there at the time and filmed that. I'm older than I look.
Yeah. So here is a very important point, that there was a spiritual alignment amongst them between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the native people. Nobody has thought this, and this is an extraordinary bit of information and perspective. And this is from Good News from New England that Edward Winslow wrote in his journal. Would you like to read that, or shall I?
Okay.
Okay, but maybe not, because you have to turn to read. Further, observing us to crave a blessing on our meat before we did eat, and after to give thanks for the same, he asked us what was the meaning of that ordinary custom, because these guys were at the home of this chief named Corbitan, who was not a lover of the English, but they had to stop and stay at his house when they had gone to help out Massasoit, which we will address next. But I told him that whatsoever good things we had, we received from God as the author and giver thereof, and therefore craved his blessing upon that we had and were about to eat, that it might nourish and strengthen our bodies. And having eaten sufficient, being satisfied therewith, we again return thanks to the same our God for that our refreshing. This all of them concluded to be very well, and said they believed almost all the same things, and that The same power that we called God, they called Khitan. So, there you have it. So here we have the Plymouth paradigm that this author, Betty Booth Donahue, who has appeared with us on several talks that we've given recently, speaks about in her book, Bradford's Indian book. You want to read it?
Sure. So she talks about the Plymouth paradigm, and really, and she's Cherokee, she's Native American, and she is really full of regret that the Plymouth paradigm did not prevail. And the three elements of the paradigm were, the way she expresses it, the Pilgrims and natives were as much alike as they were different. Both groups were highly religious, and they understood the power of the spoken word. The Pilgrims did not arrive with the idea of taking land from the natives. They bought it. They visited with each other, exchanged ideas and information and goods, and understood each other. They lived in close proximity to one another. Indians lived inside the stockade and came and went at will. Pilgrims viewed the natives as sentient human beings and valued their opinions as much as they feared their quote-unquote savagery. There was mutual respect. Had other colonies followed Plymouth, things would have been very different for natives and whites. Much suffering and loss of life and culture would have been avoided.
So here, this is curing Massasoit. Massasoit got very ill, and the Pilgrims ventured forth to honor him in his dying. And this is a telling of that. Then I called Hobomok and desired him to tell Massasoit that the governor, healing of his sickness, was sorry for the same. And though by reason of many businesses he could not come himself, yet he sent me with such things for him as he thought most likely to do him good in this his extremity, and whereof if he pleased to take, I would presently give him. Which he desired, and having a confection of many comfortable conserves, etc., whatever that might be, on the point of my knife, I gave him some, which I could scarce get through his teeth. When it was dissolved in his mouth, he swallowed the juice of it, whereat those that were about him much rejoiced, saying that he had not swallowed anything in 2 days. So he survived. He thrived. He said, hey, guys, now I see the Englishmen are my friends, and this solidified a friendship forever with the Massasoit.
And I mentioned a distance of 46 miles. That's how far those two men went on foot. There was no other alternative to deliver this conserve that saved the chief's life.
And that's down in the Soams area near Providence, Rhode Island. And that's where the Massasoit was. And that's where the whole Pokanoket country was. So that area in Rhode Island is now coming forth with the Pokanoket voice that's coming forth now with a heart and spirit of the native people for peace. And it's very important that that area become on an equal footing with Plymouth, because that's where the Massasoit was, and Plymouth was where the Pilgrims were. So that's coming forth in the future. So this is a very important thing that Edward Winslow wrote. And this was after visiting with Combatant at his house. And Combatant demanded, how durst we, being but two, come so far into the country? I answered, where there was true love, there was no fear, and my heart was so upright towards them, that for mine own part I was fearless to come amongst them. So we've got this word love just bouncing around all through these documents. And I think that's very surprising to most people to hear this way of communicating and feelings that occurred between these folks. So here we have the gathering storm. And in 1622, the Jamestown massacre that happened in Virginia, the Indian had become the enemy, and Plymouth kept the faith. They kept on a high frequency. And then in 1630 to 1640, the Great Migration occurred. 20,000 English settlers came. the Puritan Great Migration. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Connecticut Colony was formed, and a little later the Rhode Island Colony and the whole Dutch thing in New York. And in 1637, there was the Pequot War and Massacre in Connecticut. And then in 1642, the Narragansetts planned war against the English. So the frequencies were shifting. There was a vision, a seed that was planted on a high frequency, a high vision, and pressures, and more different people at different frequencies, and the next generation coming forth. Things started to get a bit dicey here and there. So, the Great Migration. Now, I'm just adding this. I just added this today because we've learned that in 1630, with this Great Migration, with the Puritans being persecuted in England, and with torture and imprisonment, and with 20,000 of them coming to New England to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was aligned with the Church of England, but established its own rules. With this Great Migration in 1630 came a man named Roger Williams, who was a radical separatist. So, do you want to run through this at all, Andrew?
Okay.
But
And remember that I mentioned that we had firstly the Puritans who were trying to purify the church, and then 20,000 of them left England because it didn't work and they were being persecuted for their different beliefs.
big time.
And the Separatists, of whom there were many groups of Separatists, but the Mayflower Pilgrims are the best known. Many groups remained in Holland and just
Right.
were assimilated.
And remember, this is 10 years later.
Right. So then we get, coming along with the Puritans to Boston, to Salem, this gentleman named Roger Williams, who was a young minister. He was a chaplain to a wealthy family in England, but his beliefs were so radically different because he was truly studying the Bible and concluding that that nobody was doing it right. He had a completely different vision of how religion should be conducted. Good luck. You can get yourself into big trouble doing that. So he got himself...
Well, his main thing was that everyone should have the freedom of conscience to relate to the divine in their own way. So this is, and he was radical in this. With the Separatists, the Pilgrims, in 1620 had set out with this desire and vision, and this guy came 10 years later and was radical about it, and he was disappointed with the Pilgrims. Actually, by then, 10 years later, the Pilgrims had lost that
initial vision. Yeah.
Because for one thing, they had to get the money together
They had to repay the money that funded the Mayflower, and they were honorable people, so they simply had to do that, which meant they had to become much more materialistic than their tendencies would have normally dictated. So Roger Williams, you've probably heard of Roger Williams, but we're just learning about him ourselves, and he is best known as the founder of Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island. Roger Williams, Separatist Puritan minister, arrives in Salem. He declines the position of minister in the Puritan Church of Massachusetts Bay Colony and challenged the church authority. He lived and preached in Plymouth Colony. He befriended the Massasoit and the Pokanoket Native Americans, and he learned the Pokanoket language.
So this is very important. So he came, and his heart, his spirit, he saw in the Native Americans what he was looking for. And that was this freedom of conscience, this freedom to relate directly to the divine, this creator-based spirituality. So he learned their language, in fact, while he was in Plymouth. He was there for 2 years, but he got disappointed in the Plymouthians and left ultimately and went back to Salem. So
in 1633, disappointed in Plymouth's level of separation, as we know, Roger was a radical separatist and was getting watered down in Plymouth. He gathered congregations in his home, which was challenging once again to the local church. You weren't supposed to do that.
To the Puritan
1634.
church, to the Puritan church, the Massachusetts Bay Colony people.
In 1634, he actually challenged the Massachusetts Bay Company or colonies, challenged their right to the land and the church and state. He was really the beginning of the separation of church and state. And he was finally banished from Massachusetts Bay in 1634.
Because what he was challenging was the whole doctrine of discovery. Okay, that the King of England had any right to the land at all to be handing it out to these settlers, which is an absurdity. In my book, it's an ultimate absurdity. But the Pilgrims were buying the land from the Indians, and so there was a whole complex situation with charters and patents and buying and who's the Indians' concept of land. So it became a royal mess, so to speak. But this was one of Roger Williams' big deals. Hey, guess what, kids? This land belongs to the Indians. You don't own it. You don't have a right to be here. Do you think that kind of got the Massachusetts Bay Colony people a little upset?
Got him banished.
Because he was challenging their charter, he was challenging their patent, and their whole domination of your secular life and your religious life. So he was quite something, this boy. So then his whole journey was amazing. He escaped deportation back to England because they were going to deport him back, and where he would have been tortured and killed by the king and all that. By secretly leaving in a blizzard in January of 1636, he slipped out of his house, left his 3 kids and wife, and off he went in a blizzard. When they came to get him, he was gone, and he had to journey down to Pokanoket land, where Massasoit took him in.
Which is about 60 miles through
60 miles through a
foot.
blizzard. I mean, it's an astounding story. And then the Massasoit actually gifted him some land, but the Plymouth folks realized that it was on their territory at that point, so he had to move, and he had also befriended the Narragansetts, who also gave him some land in another portion, another place, that he founded the town of Providence, that he named Providence because of the gift of the divine and gratitude to God. So here's this gratitude thing again. And finally, in 1663, he obtained a charter for the colony of Rhode Island. And this was him going back and forth to England. I mean, astounding story, and very important story in this native synthesis concept. And unfortunately, it's just gone by the board. I mean, who thinks of Providence, Rhode Island beyond anything except the city of brotherly love, and that whole area of Rhode Island. So this needs to come forth now into our consciousness. So this is from the 1663 Charter for the Rhode Island colony. No person within the said colony at any time hereafter shall be any wise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinions in matters of religion, and do not actually disturb the civil peace of our said colony, but that all and every person and persons may, from time to time and at all times hereafter, freely and fully have and enjoy his and their own judgments and consciences in matters of religious concernments. So, very important, freedom of conscience, which is freedom of speech, it's freedom of religion, it's separation of church and state. So, important stuff.
Another radical statement, and this time in the direction of separation of church and state and the freedom of the individual to think for oneself.
Key stuff. So here's the gathering storm. Bradford and Massasoit keep the peace in Plymouth, but guess what? You want to just...
1657, Bradford dies, the governor of Plymouth dies, In 1661, the Massasoit dies, so now it's up to the next generation who did not have the same attitudes, and the situation on the ground had changed radically. Between 1665 and 1675, the Pokanokets prepared for war. As far as I can tell, they sold land and took the money to the black market and purchased guns from the Dutch and the French.
Because it was a big deal. Do not sell guns to the native people. It was a big law.
It was completely against the law. So, and it became obvious. I mean, Indians would come into Plymouth and say, listen, you need to know, they're getting guns and training, and it's going to be dangerous. So Wamsuta was the son of the Massasoit. In 1670, he was called into Plymouth to explain what was going on, and he was ordered to surrender those guns. And we don't know what happened, but on his way home, back to present-day Mount Hope, Rhode Island, he died. And it's believed, many believe he was poisoned by the English. It's possible. We simply don't know. He got sick and died, and that's all we do know of that. In 1675, his younger brother, Metacom, also known as King Philip, declared war, which is known as King Philip's War. And many people hear King Philip's War, oh, that's got to be an English or a European king. No, King Philip was a Native American who actually started the bloodiest per capita conflict on American soil.
So the frequencies were shifting down. And we have Metacom's rebellion, or King Philip's War. He was known as King Philip.
And pretty much New England was burnt to the ground. Maine was burnt to the ground.
Providence, Rhode Island was burnt to the ground.
Providence, Rhode Island.
The home of Roger Williams. So violence replaces diplomacy. It's a civil war because they'd been living together for 50 years. Generations had been living together.
I mean, these are folks who were raised together. They've known each other from childhood, and this is happening.
So what happens after 1675, after King Philip's War, as Andrew said, is the bloodiest war per capita in American history. Ultimately, the Pokanokets lose the war. Metacom is killed by an Indian, because not all Indians were on Metacom's side. A lot of the Indians were on the British side.
Including the Mohawk, which made the difference.
Yeah, the Mohawk came in on the side of the British. And his family was ultimately sold into slavery in the West Indies, and the Indian became the enemy, no longer the friend. They didn't know, they couldn't trust any Indians. So then the Native Americans disappear from the history books, basically. After King Philip's War, you just don't hear of Indians in New England, and that was the beginning of the Indian as second-class citizen, as the situation that just grew and grew and grew as time went on. So we have the second great synthesis. Yeah. So that's what happened there in a nutshell. And what we call the second great synthesis occurred when the Iroquois Great Law influenced the U.S. Constitution. So this is later.
So we're jumping from 1675, which was King Philip's War, to what was it, 1787, the Constitution?
Yeah.
Right, so 110 years approximately.
Yeah, and in the 1700s, Ben Franklin had gone to the Iroquois to create a treaty, because the 13 colonies were looking for a way to come together because of the threats of the Indians and also threats from abroad, that they were looking for a way to come together. And the Iroquois Great Law that had come in the 1200s had brought the warring tribes of the Iroquois together in a unique fashion that kept the independence of the tribes within a federation. So,
which was an early model for what became the American Constitution.
So now we have a world out of balance right now, and we have a global pandemic, and we're looking at transfer information, as we had had mentioned, grief, breakdown, rebirth, and gratitude for shifting frequencies, for building bridges, for synthesis. So we move into the third great synthesis now, with a new perspective from this pandemic, this global understanding that we are one, and we go into healing, and we go beyond shame and blame and guilt and anger, and we go into understanding and compassion and listening to one another and honoring the humanity and the divinity in all of us, and going forward together, birthing a new way of being. So this is the third great synthesis as we come together with the native people and all people. So that's the exciting time we're in right now. And what it's going to take is an evolutionary leap into a new humanity. Barbara Marx Hubbard called it Homo Universalis. We call it Humanity 2.0. And it's an evolutionary leap in consciousness. And you want to just touch base on that?
All right, so this sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek but real possibility of Humanity 2.0, the next iteration, right, to use some terms from technology. The fully evolved human manifests the best features of all previous cultures. We are part of nature, not above it, aware of the scientific perspective, yet not ruled by it, tuned into a higher reality, yet fully present in the world. A synthesis occurs, which brings forth something that has never been on the planet before.
It's never been on the planet because the planet has never been in this frequency, this vibratory level that we're responding to now. So I made up this word pan-indigenousness, which now they're calling
Pan-indigeneity.
they're calling indigeneity.
Indigeneity.
I call it pan-indigenousness. The principles found in indigenous thought, the way of life of the native peoples of the Americas, and the essence of most tribal or traditional cultures throughout the world are principles which resonate to the deepest aspirations of all of humanity. This can be called pan-indigenousness, the common thread that ties the heart of humanity together in a vision of a world in balance. So that's where we're headed, is a world in balance. So we have an expanded paradigm. Quantum physics and unified physics and quantum mechanics is showing us that quantum reality informs the Western paradigm. So it's showing us that we're all connected, which we'll touch on. It illuminates and informs the Western paradigm. It expands our understanding of the nature of the universe, which allows us to align with the indigenous worldview. So we have
Quantum entanglement. There are two characteristics or phenomena of quantum physics that seem to be relevant to the experience of human consciousness. One of them is quantum entanglement. What does that mean? It means that we are all intimately interconnected and we are not separated by time or space. Entanglement means everything, this entire universe is one single thing throughout time and space. Pretty extraordinary. And they've done scientific experiments. If that's the case, then such and such, let's try that. And it seems to have worked. So it seems true that I, sitting here, am connected to a conscious entity on some distant star in some distant galaxy, and I can have a thought here, and in exactly the same time that person there can receive that thought. Many, many times the speed of light.
Yeah, and
The oneness of creation is another way of putting it. The fact that we are all part of a single extraordinary manifestation of consciousness. And then the second characteristic of quantum physics is the observer effect. Nothing comes into being until it is observed. Again, they've done experiments that prove this. How odd. I mean, there's a phenomenon called Einstein's mouse. Einstein did not believe this. He said, are you telling me that my house is there and it's empty, and because there's no observer there present, it doesn't exist. And then a mouse appears and observes it, and it comes into being. And then we said, yes, Dr. Einstein, that's true.
So it's very important.
He wasn't buying it. But the fact is that appears to be the case as well. Everything is potential. There are billions of potentials until an observer arrives, and somehow that process of observation brings a single reality out of all the potentials into manifestation.
Which puts the responsibility on us as far as what we put our attention on. This is key, very important, that we want to create a new reality, we have to put our attention on what we want, not what has been, not what we don't want. This is so fundamental. It's physics that we just don't understand at this point, that we just must keep our attention on what our hearts are saying is possible, and not let our minds say, no, that's not possible. Yes, it's possible, and it's happening, and it's even beyond our conscious mind. So we just have to allow it to unfold and act accordingly. So we just have this idea that it is a conscious universe, and that ultimately it is a conscious, loving universe, which we bring forth in our book, The Trust Frequency, that Rita spoke about. If we trust a conscious, loving universe, we move into that higher frequency where we are going to personally experience a new reality. It doesn't matter what our twin sister or brother or anybody else is doing. That's the consensus reality. We can move out of that reality by trusting and moving forward and acting accordingly. So that's ultimately, it aligns us with the indigenous worldview, which is key to walking and acting from this place. And here it's some attributes of the indigenous worldview, and we're just about done with this little talk. So here we go. The indigenous worldview.
Respect and reverence for all of life, interrelatedness of all things and actions, co-creative power of thought, concern for future aspects of present action, living in balance, concern for the common good, and trust in a higher power, incorporation of metaphysical into physical reality, equality of all aspects of life, sharing, cooperation.
So now you're going to be seeing all of this come to pass in our behaviors, in the systems we create. These few points, you're going to start seeing them come manifest as we open our hearts to our pan-indigenousness and to the true nature of the universe and to the natural law. So it's a very exciting time. And what I saw 30 years ago in the 90s, I saw that what's next in the evolution of consciousness of humanity is that we are going to come to understand what the indigenous peoples know about the nature of the universe, period. We're not going to go and be Native American. We're not going to take their ceremonies, and we're not going to take their way of life. We're going to tap into an understanding that they've been carrying for us and that they're expressing now. And so we access higher frequencies with a new paradigm, and we bring peace on earth and heaven to earth. So thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate your coming, and we hope to see you next time we come to the Center for Human Flourishing at the 3rd Street Center, because this is one of our homes, and we're so happy. Thank you so much, Rita, for bringing us here in this auspicious time, 2021, the close of 2021, 400th anniversary of this coming together with the Native people and the birth of the American mind and spirit and democracy. So let's carry on the us of A and bring it to pass on earth.
Thank you so much, Connie and Andrew. How can people contact you?
Well, they can go to first50years.us, first50years.us for this story and various other presentations that we've done recently with a Pokanoket clan grandmother, Barbara Mary Kerfis. So you can go there and listen to some very educational stuff with Barbara, which is very important because the Pokanokets are coming forth now and coming forth in their hearts for us to go together into the future. So that's a key. And then the trustfrequency.net. And we've got lots of YouTube stuff, and we've got lots of talks. And get our book. We have a free ebook. You can get that on the trustfrequency.net.
I'm pretty sure if you Google the Mayflower Revelations, definitely available on Amazon, available from us, you'll find it if you would like.
Yeah, so the ebook is free. It's called The Conscious Loving Universe, a Guidebook. And it's a synopsis of the Trust Frequency book. So, thanks for joining us, and
Thank
we
you
love
so
lots.
much.
Yeah. Thank you. Give you a hug.
Drive safely on the way home.
It is time to move forward. It is time to take the inspiration of the intercultural syntheses of the first 50 years of peace and friendship modeled by Plymouth Colony and the melding of the great law of the Iroquois into the Constitution to the next level. It is time to respect, honor, and understand the American Indian point of view and way of life. It is time to welcome the visionary Indian to the table through an open-hearted and open-minded invitation to sit in council together and explore how we are going to realize the principles and ideals so treasured by the founders of this nation, by the American Indian, and by all people who dream of bringing universal liberty, equality, and justice from the realm of possibility into actualization. It is time for a third great synthesis.
I believe that if the Indians and the white man would sit down and talk, it would be a much better world.
It has to come from the heart, from the spirit, from the mind of people of conscience.
There's only one creator, which is leading us all. And that's what makes us all one.
When that reconciliation catches fire, it will jump the oceans.
We do have to take care of Mother Earth and clean up our ways and respect one another and love one another. That's all it takes.
See the day, because it starts with you and it starts with me, and it has begun this moment, and nothing will stop it, because this sacred spirit fire wants to heal the entire human race, and it shall be done.
Once we recognize the role of the American Indian in the evolution of the United States of America, the dream for humanity carried to these shores by the early settlers of New England and Virginia will be realized, that we lead the world as exemplars in liberty, justice, and equality. Until that time, the United States, like a three-legged stool missing one of its legs, is out of balance without the Native American at the table.